Hey up and welcome to another episode of Last Cast. Today you join us down on the river Calder just outside Murfield. It's a nice little section this, lovely comfortable peg as you can see, and it's first time really that I've fished sort of rod and line on the rivers in probably going on 2 years, something like that, where I fished it properly and fished the stick float. So what I'm looking to do today is basically just try and catch whatever I can out of this peg. I fished it once before in the past on the pole here, which is something we might revisit, and it was full of dace, roach and perch as well, so hopefully we'll get into a few today on camera I should say, because I've already been fishing for sort of 2.5 hours, something like that, and I've already had some quality perch, a few roach and a couple of dace as well. So I'll quickly run you through what I'm fishing today. In terms of the peg, as you can see, we're between a couple of stanchions in the bridge. Basically we're fishing underneath the bridge here, so it produces a bit of natural cover for the fish. We've also got a nice sort of snag downstream where there's a sunken tree and a tree on the inside here. So first thing I've done today is looked at that and decided that's where I'm going to put my stick float line. Main thing there is what I've done is I've plumbed around incredibly carefully around that area. I know the riverbed's very slightly sloping right to left away from me. I've probably got something like sort of 6 foot, 5.5 foot, something like that down on the inside. And I've decided to fish in the white water. Something that's really important on rivers is picking an area of your peg where you can see your float down the duration of the run. If I went another couple of feet further out, the water would be dappled between dark water, white water, and again dark water from the trees, which would just make it very hard to see the float all the way down the run. So I'm just fishing on the inside of that, which means I've got a perfect line down the peg, so I know exactly how far out my bait's going, and like I say, I can see my float all the way down the run. The only other line I've put in is down the middle of the river in some slightly pacier water where it's probably about 10 foot deep, 9 foot, something like that, and that's on the Waggler. My thought with that is I'm just going to blast that with maggots all day and see what turns up, but the main plan of attack is this stick float line down the inside. So what I did initially to start with is I put probably 2 or 3 good handfuls of hemp in and laid that all the way down in a line. I've just been loose feeding the odd bit of maggot and hemp over the top. Like I say, the Waggler line, I'm just putting a pouch full of maggots in every single run through and just getting as much bait in as I can. So in terms of the rigs that I've got set up, as you can see, I've got the stick float rod in my hand. It's a nice simple stick float rig is this. I've just got a 15 foot MAP Matchtech float rod, lovely soft action in this, really soft tip, which is what you want when you're fishing small hooks for stuff like dace and roach. On the reel front, I've just got an Abu 506 closed face reel, nice and sort of classic if you like, but ideal for fishing down here where we've got a bit of downstream wind, so that closed face really does help. I've got 2.6 pound Drennan float fish on there, and then the float that I'm using, I'll just try and get this down to show you, is a Drennan alloy stick in a 4 number 4, so 0.8 of a gram. I could get away with the depth with a 4 number 4, but knowing this peg where there could be a few small fish present, I want to get the bait down, have plenty of control, and especially with the downstream wind, I want to be able to send the rig downstream and have plenty of sort of lead to hold on to when I'm basically bringing the rod back to straighten the rig out. So a nice thin bristle, really nice and sensitive, and an alloy stem. I would normally fish a lignum stick on the Calder, but because it's not too boily here and the flow's quite laminar, I'm happy to have a slightly lighter stem in the wire, and that'll offer me a slightly thinner tip. Shotting wise, I've just got 9 number 8s down there and then 2 number 9 droppers. As you can see, quite compact, all in the bottom half of the rig and just tapering out to the hook length. Hook length wise, I've just got a 6-inch hook length. See a lot of people fishing longer hook lengths on the stick, but I prefer to fish it as if I'm fishing a pole rig, so I prefer a 6-inch hook length. That's 0.105 Drennan Suplex fluorocarbon to size 18B 560. I've basically got the same hook length and hook length material on all the other rods that I've got set up. But like I say, that should produce quite a few fish down the inside, and the main thing is I've gone for a heavier float just so I've got that control. The other rods that I've got set up, I've got a Waggler rod. Again, this is a standard sort of Waggler setup that you'll see me use. It's an 0.16 or 4 pound Daewoo TDR mainline TDM reel, 3000 size. And I've just got the 13 foot medium light Waggler rod, a Garbolino one this time. Again, the rig's dead simple. It's a bit far up is the float, so I can't quite show it, but it's a Dave Harrell insert Waggler. Nice thick insert on it, but with an insert you can just read the shot down nice and easily. So that's in a 3 AAA size to combat the wind. Obviously with the depth that I'm fishing, it means that I can quite comfortably get the float out there. Shotting wise, I've just got 4 number 11s in a bulk and then 3 number 11 droppers down to the same hook length, but this time it's 30 centimetres for fishing the Waggler because it'll be more through the water, especially considering I'm just putting in a lot of maggots and they're going to be falling quite slowly. Then the other rod I've got set up is a link ledger. Again, it's something we've covered a load of times when we've been fishing on canals and rivers, is this. Just a little Shakespeare Sigma wand, again a little Daywood TDM 3012 size reel, this time with an 018 main line, just in case I do hit a snag. I want to make sure I can pull for a break on the hook length. In terms of the terminal tackle on the rig, I've just got a little link there, as you can see. That's just some doubled up fluorocarbon, 2 SSG, a couple of float stops, and then a loop to loop again to a 30 centimetre hook length, but this time it's 012 Drennan suplex fluorocarbon again because we're fishing on the bottom. There's no need to fish too light, and an 18 B560 there as well. Interesting thing I've done with this rod is I've taken one of the spare quiver tips and I've cut it down a little bit. That just makes it more suited to fish in the rivers, so I've got a white tip on there. On the Calder we have a lot of steep banking on the far bank and trees, so the water goes pretty much black, so a white tip stands out even more than an orange one, and it's just something I prefer to use and I can see the bites a bit better. So that's the rigs, all very simple. Just move that rod across. And in terms of the bait, it's even simpler. I've just got 3 pints of reds with a few whites and fluoros mixed in this change hook baits, 3 tins of hemp seed, and then a couple of dendrobinas just in case I fancy it later on down by that tree for a bigger perch on a half a dendrobine or something like that. So that's basically it in a nutshell. It's dead simple. Like I say, I'm just going to keep loose feeding sort of, what would it be, sort of 30-40 grains of hemp, and then probably 5 or 10 maggots each time over that stick float line. And as I say, it's going to be near as damn it a full pouch over the Waggler line every time I run through. So we'll carry on with the fishing now. The only other bait I've got I should mention is I've got a few tears prepared as well, just in case, again, I fancy it for a bigger roach later on, but the stamper fish has been that good on the maggot that I'll probably just stick with the maggot hook bait. So I'll get a bit more bait in the peg and then I'll run a float through and hopefully we can get a fish first chuck on camera. Right, so we'll go for a chuck on the stick now. As I say, I'm just going to keep preparing that Waggler line, keep getting plenty of bait in and just go on it every so often. In terms of I've got this plumbed up, I've just got it about 1 inch or so over depth. Because the flow's almost negligible down this inside here, I don't need to hold the float back hard, so if I was fishing in faster water I might go 3-4 inches over depth, but in this case I've just got it tripping bottom pretty much. As you can see, it's just a nice underarm cast, and you'll see what I'm doing there is flicking the float out. Because I've got plenty of lead down the line, it allows me to pull the float back and then pull the lead back towards me, and it straightens all the rig out then. Like I say, we've had a bit of a downstream wind today, and especially with us fishing under the bridge, it sort of propels the wind down the peg a little bit more, so it's been really important to go up on the size of float on both the stick float and on the Waggler as well. So when I started the session initially, I was basically getting bites right at the top end of my peg, pretty much where the bait was going in, definitely not where the bait was settling. But as the session's gone on, like I say, we're probably about 2.5 hours in, something like that now, the bites seem to be coming much further down the peg. There we go, that's a fish on straight away. So I'm just very carefully checking the line every so often. That's a nice little perch to start, probably about 2 or 3 ounces that one. That's been sort of the average size that I've had. I've had a couple of bigger perch, sort of net fish that might have been 4, 5, 6 ounce, something like that. And they came pretty much straight away when I was fishing, like I say, and catching at the top end of the peg. So I've just taken that one on a fluoro maggot. It's something I've got a lot of confidence in, is feeding red maggots and then fishing a fluoro maggot over the top. I think the perch, especially with the rain that went in sort of early morning and late last night, it's brought a bit of colour to the river as that. I mean, it's not brought the river up at all, it's pretty much at normal summer levels down here, so with that tinge of colour I think a fluoro maggot just sticks out that bit more. Especially for the perch, I think it catches their attention. So you can see I'm keeping the bait going in all the time. As I mentioned at the start, what I did was put in a couple of handfuls of hemp, basically creating a line down the peg. that I could fish over. And that's something that I'll do pretty much on all sections of the Calder, is just put a decent little bed of hemp down just to get an area for roach and dace to sort of sit over. And then I'll start introducing maggots. Again, if there's a lot of small fish, that's when you'll up the hemp and start to fish stuff like tear or double maggot over the top. And equally, if it's really hard, you'll probably just feed 2 or 3 maggots and just try and get them to pick those out as your hook bait. But with the amount of perch that are in the peg, I'm feeding more maggots than I would usually do. Like I say, if it was more roach and dace, I'd probably cut down on the maggot a little bit and feed more hemp seed. You can see I've got that float dotted well down as well. Again, because the river's not really moving through that much, I want as much sensitivity in the rig as I can get. If it was really pulling through, then usually the fish, you'll get a much more positive bite. Because as the fish stop your hook bait, basically when they take it in, the float's going to run past quicker and go under sooner. So it's just something to bear in mind when you are fishing the stick in conditions like this. If it was any slower, then I'd definitely just go for fishing a whip or a pole. Or alternatively fishing the stick float line a bit further out, but there's just enough flow there today. Just a little indication there. And you can see how easy as well it is to get the rig out with that slightly heavier shot in. As I say, I could get away, or what you'd normally do in sort of 4 or 5 foot of water with slow pace is fish a 2 number 4 or a 0.4 float. But with that downstream wind, it'd make it a nightmare to get the rig to set out properly when you're trying to lay it into the peg. Another thing to bear in mind is when you are loose feeding baits like hemp and maggots at the same time, or down the same line I should say, is always loose feed the hemp further downstream. The heavier the bait, the further downstream you need to feed it, so obviously it'll settle at the same time as the maggots. Again, with the heavier shotting as well, it does allow me at times to cast a bit further downstream. So if I think all the fish are pretty much right up by the tree, then I can cast all the way down there, whereas again, on a lighter stick float, that'll become a problem. So again, while that stick float's settling, just keep some maggots going down the middle of the river. As I mentioned, that Waggler line's probably a bit of a throwaway line just in case the stick float goes a bit funny or I want to give it a rest. And there's a bit of debris on the bottom, so occasionally the stick float's just getting held up in that. So I'm just trying to lay the rig in just slightly past where there's a bit of sort of weed on the bottom. And when I started the session, I was feeding a much more general area with the maggots, just to try and get a good idea of where exactly the float had run down cleanly. It's very easy to pick a line where you can see your float, run the float down it a few times, then realise that the bottom's sort of got bits of branches or whatever it might be getting in the way. So by just having a nice general area where you've got some fish in your peg, but you can still sort of move them around and tighten up your feed area. Just means that you're not knackering your peg straight from the off by basically picking a line to run your float down where it's not going to present the bait cleanly. So the other thing as well is at least I've always got the option, a bit of an indication there, always got the option as well if the wind becomes a problem and presentation gets difficult, I can always put the link ledger over either of the lines. And that's something really important to have set up, especially on a day like this or a peg like this where the wind can really cause a problem. So I've had a couple of spells today where the wind's been really hacking into this bank and just trying to keep the line behind the float under control on the stick float line has been impossible. It's basically been pulling the stick float into the banking. So when that's happened, I've just dropped the link ledger over the top, makes no disturbance when it goes in, I've had bites straight away. But for whatever reason, the bites seem easier to hit on the stick float than they do on the link ledger. So that's just getting slightly more towards the tree now. That was a bit of a bite there. Definitely think we're making a bit more noise now we've got the cameras on. It's going to push the fish down there naturally anyway. So as I mentioned earlier, I'll probably look to actually cast the stick float further down the peg, sort of disregard this area in front of me because I don't think they'll come that far upstream. There we go, that's another fish on. It's lovely soft action rod this, so the fish feel a lot bigger than what they are when you get them to the surface. It's another nice perch. See, he's hooked very lightly right in the top lip, that one. So it shows that how finicky they are being now that I've had a few and they've been caught. But catching fish like that, it doesn't take you long to build a decent weight. So again, with this cast, I'm just going to go a bit further downstream. It's not the best cast that time. You can already see how the wind starts to pick up a little bit again. So if that continues, that's when I'll get the link ledger out. I think as we get towards sort of the last hour of the session, last hour and a half, something like that, that's when I'll look to just put a worm on and try it right at the bottom end of the swim and see if there's a bigger perch just sitting down off the back of the feed. As I mentioned though, this might well be a peg we revisit in the next couple of weeks just to fish the pole on here, because it can be a lethal method when there's a bit more colour in the water. And it'd probably work quite nicely today. Because I'm expecting the water to be a lot more clear than it actually is. It's quite a decent tinge, as I say, because we had a sudden sort of downpour last night. Let's just put that colour into the water without bringing the level up. But if you can get the fish feeding confidently over ground bait on this peg, it's fantastic for it. Again, I don't think there's quite as many or enough roach in the peg to try a tear to try and sort out a better one. I think, as I said earlier, that it's going to be a case of fishing the maggot because it's catching a good stamp of fish, and I've got at least the chance of catching the perch then as well. You can see just how long it's taking for that float to make its way down the peg. Every so often I'll just sort of lift the line up behind the float, and that'll just bring the float upstream a little bit and get that bait to lift a couple of inches off the bottom. And I've had a couple of the perch when I've done that where the bait's just sort of fluttered up in front of them. Again, I'm sure with this rig, with the pace that I've got down the inside, if I wanted I could probably get it to stand still, but I've tried that a couple of times and for whatever reason the fish just seem to leave it alone. I think they want the bait running at them a little bit. Getting faster paced water, that's when it's better to hold the float back a bit more. Just seen a little dace top over the where I've been loose feeding the maggots in the middle of the river, so it's giving me confidence I can probably get a bite or two out there later on. So again, as that rig's getting a bit closer to the feature at the end of the peg, I'm just going to make sure the line's as tight as I can get it, and just again lift that bait up and get it to drop down again. It's probably about sort of 8 feet off it now. So again, just every so often as it gets nearer to that feature, I'm going to try and keep the bait in that area as long as I can, so I'll keep twitching it. That was a bite then. It just gives me, like I say, by just twitching it and tightening the rod tip up to the float, just gives me a bit more time in front of that feature where I expect the fish to be. There we go, that's another fish on now. It's like a decent stamped dace this time. It's a lovely fish, that. So again, you can see they're all quality fish on the maggot, so I don't think if I change to something like casters or fishing a tear, I don't think I'd get any bigger fish than that. Might have the chance of the odd better fish, but the amount of fish that you probably miss out on, I think it's probably just better carrying on with the maggot on the hook bait. And then you've always got a chance of the smaller fish as well as the bigger roach and dace that might be in the peg. And you wouldn't expect to find dace in such slow sections of the river. You'd have thought there'd be more out in the centre, but on the Calder, because it's generally quite slow, it seems that the dace are happy to sit in that sort of slower water. As well, with having the float dotted down a nice fine bristle, it's really easy to distinguish when the maggot's just tripping bottom. Again, if I had a much more thick tip on the float with a bit more buoyancy, your bait might just be stuck in a bit of this weed that's on the bottom and you wouldn't know. because it just makes it so much easier to read by fishing a finer tip float when you can get away with it and shotting it right down. That was a bite. So again, you can usually tell when it's perched that you're missing bites off the perch because the maggot won't be smashed at all. Something I'm doing as well while the bites aren't as forthcoming as they were early in the session, I'm cutting down on the feed, so hopefully putting more fish on the hook because there's less options for them to go out in terms of how many maggots I'm feeding. I'll still keep roughly the same amount of hemp going in, but as I say, if bites seem to tail off a bit, that's when I'll start to back off on the maggots. Something as well to be mindful of, obviously, when you're fishing on the inside like this with a stick float where the banking's going away from you towards the middle of the river, naturally the float's going to want to pull into that sort of middle of the river where there's more flow. So you've got to weigh it up as to where you think your bait's ending up and then running your float accordingly. So what you'll see me doing occasionally is bringing the rod to my right hand side and pulling that float back onto the line where I've plumbed up and where I'm confident that my bait's going. There we go, that's another fish on. It's obviously much easier when you're fishing down the middle of the river. It's like a nice roach this time. Yeah, when you're fishing down the middle of the river where the bottom tends to be flatter, that's where it's a bit easy, where you can just leave your float and run a waggler down it, whereas a stick float you've got to sort of work it round your peg a little bit more. That's a nice little roach. Probably 2 or 3 ounces, that one. So you can see we're already putting together a nice little mixed bag, so we've had roach, perch and dace on camera already. Another option obviously as well is if you think there's a sort of a ball of fish in just one area in your peg, say for example I'm getting bites on the stick float within sort of a 2-3 foot run, it can often be quicker to just plonk your link ledger over the top of that if the fish are feeding confidently. Obviously you're chucking straight on top of it and the bait's going straight down, you're presenting a bait much quicker to them and you can hold the hook bait in that area. So that's always something worth considering. And it looks like today, I think with the fact that the water is still fairly clear, it's just got a decent tinge to it. I think the fish are sort of, when you hook one in one area, they'll back off a little bit and you'll catch one a bit further down the swim, as opposed to getting them sort of shoaled up in one area. But again, because we're loose feeding bait, that's what I'd expect, is that you'll have fish all up and down the peg so they can settle wherever they feel comfortable. It definitely seems that when I've caught the perch, they tend to have been further up the peg. And it seems like the roach and dace have backed off a little bit more for whatever reason today. Be interesting, this little sort of area under the bridge, it's where there's a lot of small fry sort of in these little backwater bits and under the stanchions, and I think that's why the perch tend to hang around here. So it's an ideal little run down here on the inside where there's a bit of a feature towards the, let's say, the tree at the far side, a bit of cover on the inside. Obviously the stanchion where a lot of the fry are, so I think there's always going to be a few perch further up the peg here. There we go, that's another fish. It feels slightly bigger, this one. It's going out into the middle of the river. Could be a bigger perch this time. Could even be a trout, possibly. It's the interesting thing with this section, you never really know what you're going to hook. Looking how it's suddenly come up in the water further down the peg, it could well be a trout. I'm going to have to try and put a bit of pressure on this fish because it's run well downstream and I want to try and keep it away from the snags. It's just pulled off as that one. Certainly a much bigger fish though that time. It's just unfortunately done me on the hook length, that one, so I think it might be time to step it up a bit. So we'll switch the hook length over and get back out there and hopefully try and land whatever that was. Right, so we've had a go on the link for a bit there. We've had a couple of indications but no fish, so I'm just going to chuck out the Waggler now and have a look and see if there's a fish on that line. Again, because I've been putting such big pouchfuls of bait in, unless there's lots of fish in the peg or a few decent stamp ones, then it might be a case that we struggle to get consistent bites on it. But it's a bit of a throwaway line just to see if I can get a few bigger fish, or as I say, like a bigger shoal going in the middle of the river. As you can see there, I'm casting out with a much bigger capacity float well past where I'm feeding, putting the loose feed in upstream of the float and then bringing the float back in line and letting it run. That was an indication there. So we've just had a little bit of a bite then. Again, as I've done with the stick float, I've got this dotted well down. So again, casting downstream, getting a pouch full of bait in, and opening the bail arm and letting the float run. The important thing on the Waggler that I've fallen foul of in the past is he's not fishing basically far enough downstream. You look at your peg and think there's plenty of, like here where there's good tree cover in front of you, but it's very hard to get control of the line behind the float when you're casting directly in front of you. You want to cast well downstream so you've got control of the line then. So might need trimming a bit this float, but we'll give it another chuck and just see if it needs me to take a number 8 off it. Then big thing with river fishing is just getting into this rhythm of your casting and your feeding. It definitely needs trimming this float, so I'll take a number 8 off it, I think, or 2, and just pop it up that little bit more because I know that it's just dripping bottom out there. So something that's worth bearing in mind is, so I've run through it on previous episodes when we've done Waggler fishing, but especially on rivers like this and when you're fishing further out, what I've actually done is plumbed up using a 5 AAA Waggler, knowing that I'll fish a 4 AAA, but I've plumbed up with a 5 and not put any bulk shot on Just means that there's as much buoyancy as I can get in the rig to pull against the plummet, so I get a good positive reading of the depth. Again, if I shotted the float fully and then tried plumbing up, it'd be a nightmare to try and see the float, because especially with the flow here, it'd just be pulled under. So I'll just crush this number 8 off and give it another chuck. So I definitely had a bite then on the first run through. Alright, so again, I've just trimmed that float there. I've taken a number 8 off it. Again, cast well past the feed area, get bail arm open, then drag the float back into the line that I'm fishing. Again, it just gives me a chance to rest that inside stick float line. So I shouldn't be disturbing it with a rig or casting over the top of it with a link ledger or anything. So hopefully, if there's any better fish present, that's a biting a fish on. If there's any better fish present in the peg there, then they just get time to settle and hopefully come away from that snag. It's a nice stamp roach from the middle of the river. Lovely fish nailed right in the top lip and pristine condition. This stunning fish out of the Calder. Again, all the fish that I'm catching at the moment, I'm taking them all on a single fluoro maggot. It's a nice run, is that down the middle, because upstream, what I've not mentioned is there's a bit of a bend upstream of us here, and that pushes all the flow to the far bank, so it's beyond this middle stanchion. And I'm just fishing basically the fast waters, probably 3/4 of the way across between the middle stanchion of the bridge and the far bank. I'm just fishing on the inside of that. Again, at the start I leaded around at sort of the edge of the trees, and it's incredibly snaggy. There's clearly like a big sunken tree or something out there. So it's not worth going into the really quick water, because I'll just get hook lengths broken. So it's just enough pace where it's a different sort of run to what I'm fishing on the stick, where it's shallower. It's probably sort of 3-4 foot shallower on the stick float line. Obviously a lot less pace down there, so it means that I'm covering a couple of different areas of the river now. Obviously, with fishing such a big sort of feed area in the middle of the river on the Waggler line, it means that I can sort of, if I miss a bite off the back of the feed, I can then strike and bring it into sort of the middle or the near side of the feed. So at least I get a couple of chances then of running the bait down the peg. Same again there, I'm able to get 2 strikes out of that. Might even need another number 8 off it, this one. I think I'll take another number 8 off it. Just means the float won't just dip under when it's running down the peg and tripping bottom. And every time I'm coming back, there's just a little bit of weed on the line. So if I take another number 8 off it and it starts to drag under again, then I'll just probably take an inch or two off the rig. But with a Waggler, because unlike a stick where you can hold it back, with a Waggler you've got to let it run through at the pace, so the only way of slowing the hook bait down to the speed that your loose feed will be going along on the bottom, the only way to achieve that is by setting the Waggler over depth. So it's just a case of balancing how much bristle you need to show so it doesn't dive under when it's tripping bottom. And then, like I said, judging that against how far over depth you're fishing. Again, it's something I do around my Waggler as well. I've got it in my hand, as I'll show how I've shotted this. As you can see, I just keep a couple of stots above the Waggler. That's just for plumbing up, and obviously stopping the float at the top of the line. Then I've got the bulk shot, and then I've got number 8s beneath it that do 2 jobs. Firstly, like you've seen there, I can trim the float down, and secondly, it creates a boom away from the bulk. And fishing like that, you never get a tangle. The other side of it is obviously having a slight gap between the bulk and the top shot, so it just means that the float can collapse on the strike. So something to bear in mind is that. So you can see there possibly on the camera where the feed's gone in and the float's just running in front of that. There's a bite there. So I can just strike and then let the float run back through the peg again. So in this case it'll be the near side of the feed. Again, I've always got the option of chucking the link over this line as well. So with the Waggler as well, it enables me to search much more on my peg than I can do on the stick float, because I'm fishing right down the swim. Another thing to consider obviously when you're float fishing on rivers is trying to pick an area of your peg which is where you intend to catch the bulk of the fish. So say on the stick float line, the main area that I've obviously plumbed up all the way down the run, but there's an area where I know I can see the float clearer than any other spot and where I think my bait's going to settle, so I've spent a bit more time plumbing that up and just making sure it's clear. That's the fish on now. Same with the Waggler, using, it's another nice stamp roach, using especially on rivers, more like rather than sort of picking a far bank marker where you might have a tree or something, is picking an area of water where it might be sort of really dark in one patch, sort of where the shadow of an overhanging tree is, and picking that as a general area to catch on, rather than picking a far bank marker, which would mean you're fishing in a much tighter area. It's hard to explain, but when you put it into practice, it just means that you sort of know where to expect bites. You know as a reference point where you're casting and where your feed should be ending up. You can see that downstream wind swirling a bit, so I'm just having to keep checking the line, and that again is where it's really important to have a nice fast action and long rod. So in this case I'm fishing a 13-foot Waggler rod. Comes as 12 foot, but you can put a 1 foot extension in that I've put in today, and it's made a ton of difference just to be able to control the line a bit better. Getting over in that sort of faster water, I wouldn't expect to catch the perch out there because it is a bit quicker, and I think they prefer to sit on the inside of these sort of runs where you catch them on a stick float line. Out there I'd expect roach, but I'd also expect dace. You can see there with that cast I can pretty much reach the far bank with this Waggler if I wanted to. So you always want to pick a Waggler that's going to go further than your feed area. It just offers you a lot more control when you're trying to tighten the line up to the float. The float won't drag back as far as it would do as if it was a lighter float. Say if I was fishing a 3BB Waggler out there, I could get it to that range, but when I have to mend the line, the float's more likely to come back further towards me and come offline then in that case. Right, we've got another fish on the Waggler now. Again, they're all starting to come from the same area of the peg, just in line with the tree that's on the far bank. It's another nice roach this. I think we'll just net him. And a lovely stamper fish to be catching on the river Calder here, these. See, all in mint condition. And hooked perfectly, every single one's been right in the top lip. Again, something that I tried briefly this morning was fishing double maggot on the stick, and I could not get a bite on it, so I'm not trying it on the Waggler. So when the stamper fish is that good on single maggot, there's no need to risk masking the hook point with double maggot and not getting as many bites. Right, so there we go, that's another fish on the Waggler now. So we've just had that, another sort of 4-ounce roach, run it through again, and we've got another, so it looks like there's a decent shoal of fish sat out there now. See what this one is. It's another stamp roach. So as I said, if it's a case that on the stick float that there's not a decent shoal of fish down there, I think we might as well plug it away at it on the Waggler and see if we can get a decent bag of these roach out. But at least I've got 2 lines now where there's fish feeding on both, so that means I can rotate them when one of them goes quiet. So it's an ideal situation, is this, where both lines are producing. It's a bit wobblier. Right, we've just hooked a better fish now on the Waggler line. I've had a couple of runs through and I've not had a bite. This feels like a good fish. It's starting to kite towards those snags. Be interesting to see what this is. It certainly feels like it should be a pound or so. It's swimming upstream, which is usually the sign of a bigger fish. Again, we're only on the same sort of gear, still very light. Just seeing it now, can't quite make out what it is though. Could be a chub this. No, it's a trout. Thought very similar to the one that we lost, so I think that might have been a trout as well. There's not as many on this peg, from what I'm aware. They seem to be on the next peg up or so because it's a bit shallower and quicker there. But again, another species hooked right in the corner of his mouth. Really lightly hooked that one. But at least we've got him out. As I say, that I suspect what we lost early was probably a trout. So we'll get him popped straight back, no need to keep him in the keep net. Hopefully that's not disturbed the shoal roach that was out there too much. Right, so as you can see there, that's our final net of fish. We've probably got 5 or 6 pounds, something like that in there, but as you can see, it's a lovely stamp fish that we've caught, some quality perch. I think that one being one of the bigger ones of the day, probably 4 or 5 ounce, something like that. A few nice little dace, and quite a few of these stamp roach up to that sort of size. I think that being one of the bigger ones of the day. All caught on the Waggler and the stick float. We've probably caught pretty much the same amount of fish on both today. Probably the stick early was the best, but we've even had a couple of fish on the link, but again, it's not been overly productive for the bigger stamp fish. The bigger perch haven't shown, but we've caught a lovely bag of fish there, and like I say, can't be too disappointing. We've only fed probably a tin of hemp and probably 2 pints of maggots, so it's been a nice little day's fishing. Good 6-hour stint here on the River Calder, so we'll get these put back. But as always from Last Cast, thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you on that next episode.